Welcome back. As we discussed earlier, blood is divided into two different parts. There's plasma and then there's formed elements. Plasma is the fluid part. Formed elements are all the different cellular components. We're going to walk through all these different parts of the blood in just a few minutes and over the next two lectures. But this lecture we're going to focus on plasma and we're going to talk about red blood cells. In the next video, we'll talk about white blood cells and platelets. Now, plasma is composed mostly of water. When you hear the fluid component of blood, the thing that should pop into your mind is water, right? So water is what our blood is mostly made up of. Other than, or plasma is mostly made up of. We also have plasma proteins. We'll talk about that in a second. We also have other dissolved molecules, including ions, right? Hormones, that kind of stuff. Nutrients, they can all be dissolved in there as well. Things that are not proteins. The proteins get categorized as proteins, right? We also notice that it is the straw-colored part of this fluid, of this blood. And so we see this straw portion there. Looks good. It's all good. When we talk about plasma proteins, this is actually a pretty diverse group of proteins. Mostly these are going to be made by the liver. And we're going to see some major categories of these, and we're going to spend some time looking at them. We're going to talk about albumin, globulins, fibrinogen, other clotting proteins. Fibrinogen and other clotting proteins, those should be categorized kind of together. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's talk for a minute about albumin, right? So we'll talk about albumin. Albumin is a really important protein, plasma protein. It is going to contribute to the oncotic pressure. We're going to talk a lot more about oncotic pressure, but if you remember back when we talked about osmosis, right? One of the things that is present in that idea of fluid movement and water balance and that type of thing was talking about molecules that did not cross the plasma membrane. Well, albumin kind of works like that in that it helps to create this concentration of proteins that keeps fluid in the blood. So you can think about it like vacuuming or sucking that fluid back into the blood. We're going to talk about in just a few short lectures is that fluid is going to leave from the arterial end of the blood of the circulatory system. It's going to come back on the venous end of those capillaries. So blood's going to go out to the tissues in the arterial end, come back on the venous end. Don't worry, we'll get into all that. But the thing that pulls that fluid back in is what we call albumin, right? And so when we talk about albumin, we talk about this either colloid osmotic pressure, this is also called oncotic. All right, so those two types of pressure, and this is really, albumin's a really big component that's pulling that fluid back in. Let's walk through an example of this. So you probably have seen images or videos on TV of children that are starving, yet they have these very large distended bellies, right? They have these large distended bellies, and you're like, gosh, it seems like their bellies are full. Reality is that when you look at this child has not been given the proper nutrition. Whether they're starving or they're just not having a balanced diet, they do not have enough protein in their diet. And if you remember what protein's used for, it's for building blocks. It's to make other proteins by your body. And so if they don't have protein, then your liver can't make protein. It can't make albumin. And so if we don't have albumin, then all of a sudden the osmotic pressure is going to drop. That oncotic pressure drops, right? If that oncotic pressure drops and is lower, now we're not sucking and pulling that fluid back into circulation. Instead, it stays out in the tissues. And so here, the fluid went out into the tissues like it normally does, but there is nothing pulling it back in. And so all this distended belly that you see here is full of fluid. Right? So with low plasma osmotic or oncotic pressure, that fluid will stay out in the tissue and will not be sucked back into the bloodstream. Here's a great example of how important albumin is, as well as proper nutrition. Okay. Other plasma proteins besides albumin, we talk about globulins. And so there's a couple different types of globulins, but globulins, the one that we're going to speak most about is called an immunoglobulin or an antibody. And these are involved in the immune system. And so we'll talk about these in detail a little bit later on. It's going to be in the next unit when we get to the immune system. We also have fibrinogen, and fibrinogen we'll talk about a little bit more in this chapter. It is going to be a protein that is going to be involved in helping blood clot, formation of a blood clot. We'll talk about that again in the next lecture. The last thing that we talk about is regulatory proteins. So another category here, enzymes that help with chemical reactions, hormones, that type of stuff, traveling through the blood. It's a regulatory type of protein. Now, that's talking about plasma. But not only do we have plasma, but we also have formed elements. Now, the interesting thing about this is formed elements, no matter what type of formed element you have, it is made in red bone marrow. No matter what, it's made in red bone marrow. So if you're a red blood cell, an erythrocyte, a white blood cell, a leukocyte, or you're a platelet, you were made by you're made in the red bone marrow. Okay, we're going to differentiate some of this a little bit later on. They all start off with the same stem cell. And if you remember how stem cells work, it depends on what signal they get, tells them what to become. So let's say that this cell gets some multi-CSF to grow, and then it gets something called EPO. We're going to talk about EPO more in a minute. If it gets EPO, it's going to eventually turn into an erythrocyte, a red blood cell, right? But let's say it gets something else. Let's say it gets thrombopoietin. If it gets thrombopoietin, it's going to become a platelet, right? And you can just go through and see different things there. You can go through the depth of your book, but realizing that this starts out with one blood cell. All these cells are made in the red bone marrow. And if you remember back from last semester, red bone marrow is abundant through all the cells of children, or not all the cells, most of the bones in children, and less so in adults. And so you remember the vertebrae was an example of an adult, or the coxal bones, right, the hip bone, or just the head of the femur, the proximal head of the femur. If you remember those things, like there's only various places in the body that has red bone marrow in adults, but it makes all of these formed elements. Now, the first type of formed element we're going to talk about is an erythrocyte. Now, erythrocyte is really kind of a neat thing. It's the most abundant cell. And as a matter of fact, depending on where you live and what your gender is, you may have more red blood cells than anything else in your blood. Like that hematocrit, just counting red blood cells, could be above 50%. So there's a lot of red blood cells in the blood. A very high proportion of the fluid of the blood is erythrocytes. So these guys have to be pretty important. They have to do something special, and they do. They do something very important, and their job is to carry oxygen. And to a lesser extent, they'll also carry carbon dioxide as well. These are nice, we'll call them biconcave discs. I think of them like little inner tubes, right? You think about the inner tube that you have in the summer, you jump in the thing, the ones with the centerpiece in it. They look like biconcave, right? Kind of looks bulgy on the sides, looks thinner in the middle. This is what they look like. They're really smooth, they're flexible, they're able to move, they're able to slide through small blood vessels. This is a wonderful thing. During their development, some interesting things happen. For one, it gets to the point where it ejects the nucleus. It says, we don't have room for this. We're getting rid of the nucleus, we're going to get rid of other organelles, so we're not going to have them. So they're not going to live very long. They only live at most about 120 days. So less than 120 days. That's all they're going to live. Then they need to be replaced. Okay, so you're constantly replacing your red blood cells. And that's one of the reasons it's okay to donate blood, because you're constantly donating them. So why do they get rid of the nucleus? Why do they get rid of their organelles? If they kept those things, they'd survive longer. It's because they make this one really, really, really important protein called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is going to be the actual protein structural component that's going to carry oxygen. And so we're going to see it's a little bit more complex than just being a protein. We're going to see that in just a minute. But this is what allows them to carry oxygen. So really what you end up with is this bag full of hemoglobin that is going to be able to carry oxygen. That's a wonderful thing, because their job is to carry oxygen, right? They're going to carry the majority of the oxygen in your blood. Over 95% of the oxygen is going to be carried by erythrocytes. That's pretty amazing. Okay, so let's look at hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is this molecule that you see here. And what you're actually seeing in this kind of lighter tan color and this darker brown is the protein component. This is the globulin component of the hemoglobin molecule. Now, each of these, because you can see that there's 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, each of them have a heme group. And so it's blown up there, but you can see it there, 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 and there. So each of these hemoglobin molecules, right, this full mature hemoglobin molecule, has 4 heme groups. And right in the center of that heme is a molecule of iron, right? So it has a molecule of iron, and this is the place where oxygen is actually going to bind. So O2 is going to actually come in to bind here. So let me ask you a quick thought question. How many molecules of oxygen can one hemoglobin molecule bind? I'll give you a second. Okay, what'd you come up with? I sure hope you said 4, right? Because there are 4 hemes, that means we can bind 4 oxygen. Okay, so that's really important when you think about that, as the ability to bind 4 molecules of oxygen. And this actually is pretty weak binding. We'll talk about some of those dynamics a little bit later on, but that's a really important thing with that. We also do have the ability to carry carbon dioxide on this, and if carbon dioxide binds, then we call this carb amino hemoglobin. We don't carry a lot of carbon dioxide, but we can carry some carbon dioxide on that as well. So that's hemoglobin. Red blood cells are stuffed full of hemoglobin because it's so important. Their job is to carry oxygen, right? That's what they do. Now, how are they made? We know that they're made in red bone marrow, right? We know that they are made from that same hemocytoblast, right? That same stem cell. But what causes them to be made? Where do they come from? Like, what is that? So the first thing is the stimulus for this is, for the stimulus for the production of red blood cells, is a decrease in blood oxygen levels, right? So you see that here, right? A decrease in O2. So if there's not as much oxygen flowing through your blood, something has to be able to monitor that, and that happens in the kidneys, right? We've talked about this receptor concept, and that's in the kidneys. And the kidneys say, okay, looks like oxygen levels are low. We're going to release a hormone. Yes, another hormone. A hormone to stimulate red blood cell production. And you see this abbreviation here, EPO. Right? You see that abbreviation EPO. And EPO is something called erythropoietin. ERYTHRO. POIETIN. Erythropoietin. Erythropoietin, it's abbreviated erythro. This is a hormone, and that hormone goes into the bloodstream. You see it there. These little blue triangles are indicating that. And then they come out of the blood. That erythropoietin comes out of the blood, stimulating our red bone marrow to make more red blood cells. If we have more red blood cells, now we can carry more oxygen. More red blood cells, more oxygen carrying capacity. That's a pretty great thing, right? Carry more oxygen, deliver more oxygen to your tissues, make more energy, make more ATP, survive longer. That's pretty awesome. So, the kidney is not only going to monitor oxygen levels, but it also releases erythropoietin. But those red those red blood cells are made by the bone. Okay, made in the red bone marrow. Okay, so we know erythropoietin is going to be a pretty important hormone, right? It's going to make more red blood cells. And so we're going to stick with this. And so there's some ways that we can influence that erythropoietin production. One is testosterone. I touched on this in the previous. Testosterone levels actually cause the kidney to make more erythropoietin. Therefore, males have more red blood cells, right? Have a higher percentage of red blood cells because they have more testosterone, right? Okay, another thing is altitude, right? Altitude. So if you go up in high altitudes, you're going to make more red blood cells. Why? Because when you get up in high altitudes, there's not as much oxygen. If there's not as much oxygen, that means there's less oxygen traveling through your blood. If there's less oxygen traveling through your blood, what organ's going to get it? The kidney. The kidney's going to say, hey, hold on. I need to just release some EPO. And so the kidney releases EPO. Same thing with the testosterone levels. And so if you have increased erythrocytes, you now have the ability to carry more oxygen. Carry more oxygen. You need to carry more oxygen. Okay, so I'm kind of a fan of biking. I really like doing it myself, mountain biking, but I also like watching the Tour de France. And the Tour de France, one of the best cheating sports in the world, right? They have figured out all different ways to be able to do things to increase their performance. One thing that they do a long time or years ago is that people injected themselves with their own red blood cells, right? Take the red blood cells out, put more in, carry more oxygen, make more energy, be able to survive longer, especially when you're going into the mountains, right? They may also train in higher altitudes just to make more red blood cells. It makes your heart work harder, but you make more red blood cells. Another thing you can do, and that was done, is inject yourself with erythropoietin, and that was done. It's now banned, but if you inject yourself with erythropoietin, you can make more red blood cells, have more oxygen carrying capacity, right? You can go for longer. All right, just really quickly on erythrocyte destruction. Red blood cells do not have a nucleus. They have a limited lifespan, maximum of 120 days, and therefore they have to be destroyed, right? And when they get destroyed, all the different parts of it have to be recycled or removed or replaced. And so you see the protein part, the globulin part, that just gets recycled into amino acids, and the cells can use that for other things. When you look at the heme component of that, that's all of this without the iron in the middle, that needs to be disposed of. And then finally, and so when that heme is destroyed, that's when you get like these pigmented proteins. Like you hear about jaundice, right? The liver usually breaks down these red blood cells. If the liver's not working right, you might get jaundice. It's because you get a yellowish color associated with this. All right, we're done with red blood cells for the time being. We'll come back because blood type is going to be an important thing. We'll talk about that in a little bit. When we come back, we'll talk about white blood cells and platelets.